Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Healing Outside the Box. My name is Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. This is episode 183, and I'm calling it How to Make a Recipe Your Own. Now, I have to tell you that I was outside in my garden yesterday, and I noticed something quite bizarre. There were button mushrooms growing in my garden, right next to my dahlias, right out of the ground. Not around a tree or any such thing. I live a block from the ocean, so there's not a lot of wooded area around here. We do have one tree, but that's it. Then I looked around our property and saw mushrooms growing on the side of the brick building, and that area normally gets a lot of sun. This is the first time in my life I've ever seen mushrooms in my flower garden. I want to round up the usual suspects, which is always Monsanto and, more specifically, Roundup. See episode 181. But I think it's more complicated than that. We have our climate change, our environmental chemicals, our mushrooms growing next to petunias, and now my cat Betty has a plastic fetish. Look it up, it's a real thing. Woe is me. I'm going to need one of those sandwich board signs. Maybe I can string it around my wheelchair, saying, "The end is near." Thank God we have a perfectly stable political situation in this country. Anyway, I'm here today to tell you what you can do with your zucchini, and I mean that only in the nicest possible way. But first, I wanted to bring to your attention a couple of YouTube videos. The first video is a TED Talk by a guy that they call the guerrilla gardener. His name is Ron Tinley, and he's very inspiring. Even if you don't want to do vegetable gardening in your own community, you should listen to him just for some inspiration in general. I'll give you a link in the show notes to this particular video, but you can also just go to YouTube and type in Ron Tinley. That's R-O-N, last name F-I-N-L-E-Y. I get so excited when I see guys like Ron taking the reins and leading us to where we need to go. And where we need to go is more local farming, community gardens, and schoolyard vegetable gardens. The second video is another TED Talk by Jamie Oliver. You may have seen Jamie Oliver promoting his nutrition education for school children somewhere else, but this TED Talk brings it all home. He first goes into the huge cost of our obesity epidemic, especially in young people. And the cost is obviously in suffering as well as dollars. And then he suggests how we can begin to tackle this problem. He says we need to start teaching our kids in school about growing their own food, cooking their own food, and perhaps eating that food in the schools instead of the crap they are now getting. He also makes the suggestion that I've been flapping my gums about for years. And it's this. We need to start cooking lessons in school and educate every child in every school, not just a few wealthy children in Brooklyn. Again, I will give you the link in the show notes, but you can just go to YouTube and search Jamie Oliver TED Talk. I also have an update on Dwayne Johnson and the court battle that he's having with Monsanto. His trial is now taking place. I'll give you a link to this article in the show notes, but you can also Google Dwayne Johnson and Monsanto. In the trial thus far, Mr. Johnson's lawyers are laying out the case that because he was exposed to Roundup on a daily basis, because his job is to spray it in schoolyards, and yes, he was working for the city, he ultimately had no choice in being exposed to what we now know is a carcinogen. This brings to light the evidence linking Monsanto's Roundup to cancers. In his case, he has non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he may be dying. The point that they're trying to make is that he is not the only person dying because Roundup is being sprayed in many schools just to kill dandelions. And, oh yeah, exposure to Roundup causes cancer. Now, back to the episode. Let's discuss how you can switch ingredients to make a recipe according to what you like to eat and how you like to eat it. If you want to replace an ingredient, you first need the why. In other words, you may want to stay away from grains that have gluten. Or 2, you may be allergic to a specific ingredient, say strawberries, or just have an adverse reaction to it. You may be on cumin and need to stay away from foods that are rich in vitamin K. And that would be your spinach, kale, Brussels sprouts type vegetables. 3, you may want to substitute an item that has a lot of saturated fat. 4, you may want to substitute an item that has a lot of sugar. Or 5, you might just not like a particular ingredient and you prefer another. Okay, first let's talk about gluten in wheat flour, since everybody seems to be talking about it. There are lots of flour substitutes out there. You could use oat flour, rice flour, sprouted corn flour, but make sure you get the organic when it comes to corn. An example might be Ezekiel bread. That is actually made from a sprouted corn flour. You also have almond flour, chickpea flour, and, believe it or not, coconut flour. They're all gluten-free. You don't necessarily have to go to Whole Foods, though. There's a couple of supermarket brands that you can get. Now, I don't have any particular financial attachment to any of these brands. I'm just going to list them. King Arthur brand has a gluten-free flour that's actually a blend, and it can be found anywhere. It's white rice, brown rice, tapioca starch, and potato starch. Arrowhead and Bob's Red Mill brands also have alternatives to the gluten-free flour. In addition, I believe all 3 have a sprouted grain flour that has a lower gluten content but will rise for you. You can substitute cornmeal for flour, but remember that the cornmeal will not rise. You may have to add another flour to blend in. If you're wondering about measurements for any of these, feel free to email me with a question about it, and I'll look into it and email you back. When it comes to the substitute flours, I like oat flour because it has a high protein content and lots of soluble fiber. You need about 1.5 cups oat flour for every cup of white flour. If you're making something like apple crisp, you can also replace rolled oats for the flour. As for breadcrumbs, if you're making, say, meatballs or meatloaf, you can try rolled oats or a crushed oat cereal. If you don't have a gluten intolerance, you can always do a half white, half wheat, and you don't have to change the other ingredients. If a recipe calls for you to thicken with flour and you want gluten-free, you can use a little cornstarch, but only use half of the amount recommended. Now, if you are a paleo person and want to substitute for breadcrumbs, you can always substitute with coconut and coat your chicken with that. When it comes to specific food allergies, I don't want to get too involved in details because you should be talking to a health professional about specific allergies. In general, you can simply substitute a similar item with a similar water content. But you can email me as well with general questions about allergies. Now, when you're reducing the fat in a recipe, people usually go with fruit or fruit juices or purees. When people use fruit, they generally use apples. But I don't find that apples impart a lot of flavor, and a peeled apple has essentially no nutritional value. If you're replacing apples or applesauce, you'll need a fruit with some liquid. A plum puree might be cool, or dates that you can throw into the processor, or pumpkin puree. You get the picture. You'll need something that adds moisture. If you want to specifically stay away from saturated fat, like butter, the most common substitute we recommend is olive oil. It's generally 3/4 cup of olive oil to every cup of butter. If you don't want to memorize that, just think that you'll need a little less of the olive oil. Now, when it comes to dairy in general, you can use the rule of thumb that substituting low fat for the full fat product will often work. If a soup calls for, say, heavy cream, and you want the thickening that a cream soup will give you, you can try a low fat version, say skimmed evaporated milk or sour cream or you could use milk and add a little bit of flour to thicken it up. And if you don't want the wheat flour, just substitute with cornstarch. Now, if you're doing a vegan soup, I would suggest using a vegetable puree. Cauliflower puree is very popular, or a potato puree, or a carrot puree. And the reason those are popular is because they're mild. Using something like split peas will make the whole recipe taste like peas. Now, eggs. For every 1 egg, you can substitute 1/4 cup egg substitute or 2 egg whites. That will work for almost anything. Now, another source of fat that is seldom recognized is salad dressings. Now, with salad dressings, you may want to stay away from the heavy, creamy this or creamy that. A lower calorie salad dressing might be something like poppy seed dressing or raspberry vinaigrette. In the latter, you may want to watch the added sugar if you're a diabetic. If you want something fancy, like a tahini dressing, you can normally find that in the produce section of the supermarket. Now, bacon. I know. I'm going after the bacon. You can always substitute Canadian bacon or a smoked turkey. And no, it's not bacon, but that's a good thing. Okay, so you're getting the basic idea for foods other than vegetables. But I want to talk to you about vegetables because it is, after all, July and lots of great vegetables are plentiful. Except if you live in Argentina or Brazil. In that case, you may want to find a substitute for all of the beef that you guys are grazing on down there. Or is it up there if I turn around? Anyway, let's talk about vegetables. Here is what I want to say. If you don't like broccoli, don't eat it for goodness sake. There's only about 100 substitutions in your grocery store. Again, if you're cooking, you can substitute vegetables by similar water content, nutrients, or cooking method. Let's say you're making a spinach lasagna, and you're not crazy about spinach. Because spinach gives off a lot of water, you may want to substitute with, say, zucchini. You can substitute with mushrooms as well. When you don't want moisture, then the opposite is true. If you're cooking, say, an omelet or quiche, you may want to be aware of the watery vegetables because they will make your final product a little watery. To get around this, you can always saute in advance. Onions and peppers won't make much of a difference because they won't add a lot of water to the finished product. The same goes for pizza. Peppers and onions are popular toppings because they don't make the pizza too soggy. You could substitute artichoke hearts, broccoli, or already sautéed mushrooms. Zucchini won't work because it gets too watery. If you've got specific questions, feel free to contact me on my contact page, and I'll get back to you with an answer. You can also send me a recipe that you want fixed, and I'll fix it for you. Okay, now, say you're substituting food ingredients and you want to keep the same nutrients. So you may want to substitute protein for protein. For example, if you don't like lima beans, and fava beans conjures up visions of Silence of the Lambs, you can always substitute a similar bean, like a kidney bean, a red bean, or a cannellini bean. They all have about the same amount of protein, fiber, and vitamins. When it comes to vitamins in particular, I'll often mention them in color groups. In other words, the red, orange, yellow vegetables have a lot of vitamin A and C. So, if you're cooking a stir-fry dish, you can substitute almost any red, orange, yellow for another red, orange, yellow. The dark greens are rich in the B vitamins and also have some iron, potassium, and other minerals. Again, if you're on Coumadin, watch out for the vegetables with high vitamin K. All of the dark green vegetables have lots of fiber as well. And just about all of the above vegetables have lots of antioxidants. In general, the deeper the color in either of these two categories, the denser it is in vitamins. So if you're doing a stir fry, you can substitute broccoli, spinach, kale, peppers, bok choy, pea pods, or most of the cabbages for any other recipe ingredients. Now, substituting for different cooking methods can be a little trickier. For example, in the case of rice, you can boil it, steam it, or bake it, but the amount of water you add will vary with each method. With fish, you can steam it, broil it, bake it, fry it, or sushi it, but there are rules for each one, and it may be best not to change cooking methods unless you can tell when it's safely cooked. And when it comes to sushi, the old saying, "Don't try this at home," applies. With produce, of course, the cooking methods don't matter as much, safety-wise that is. And this is because foodborne pathogens prefer meat, chicken, and fish. Having said that, we all know that it's possible for produce to spoil or grow mold. Training yourself to do the sniff test might be a good idea with most produce and certainly dairy products. In conclusion, all of this is to say that anyone can become confident switching ingredients around. It's a matter of practicing and keeping an eye out for what the good cooks do, either on TV, in restaurants, or in cookbooks. And if you're still not convinced that you can pull this off, I can offer you online nutrition and cooking lessons, and I would be happy to work out all of the kinks for you. You can reach me in the comments section or email me on my podcast page, which is healingoutsidethebox.com. And, unless you're Alice in Wonderland, don't eat the backyard mushrooms. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.